Aliens thought humanity was frail. They believed our species would crumble on harsh worlds and succumb to exotic pathogens without the aid of their advanced pharmaceuticals. Yet on the planet Moraine, a place of crimson dunes and poisonous dust storms, one human doctor would prove that Earth-born immune systems held secrets even the galaxy's most sophisticated medicine had overlooked. Bacteria Eliana Cruz stepped outside the makeshift infirmary at the dawn of a Moraine morning. The sunrise spilled an eerie, pinkish light across the horizon, where jagged rock spires rose like broken teeth from the sand. She could taste the metallic tang of Moraine's atmosphere through her respirator. The desert wind whipped coarse red grains against her boots, forcing her to squint. Even with the shelter of the respirator's filter, she could smell the chemical bite of toxins swirling in the air. Medical Command had provided her a standard-issue suit designed to stave off surface-level contaminants, but she still felt vulnerable. Every day she reminded herself that vulnerability did not mean weakness. She was due for a routine inspection of the outer triage stations, where newly arrived soldiers and scouts were held for decontamination. Their job was to push deeper into the shifting dunes to keep the lines secure against the Rabek, a hostile species that had perfected the art of biochemical warfare. Eliana was not a soldier, but the demands of an interstellar conflict had pulled her from Earth into the Allied forces. After finishing her training, she found herself assigned here on Moraine, a remote outpost that tested not only her skills, but also the boundaries of medical knowledge across multiple alien species. She was told to rely on the advanced Auraxian treatments, to trust in the pharmaceuticals developed by older, more technologically robust civilizations. But her own training whispered that human bodies, though perceived as fragile, had a remarkable capacity to adapt. Just as she prepared to proceed to the triage area, Commander Idrix approached. He stood nearly 2 meters tall, lean and poised like a predatory insect. His eyes had an elongated shape and an amber sheen, typical of the Aurax. In the direct glow of the rising sun, his polished uniform reflected subtle gold patterns, emblems of his rank in the Allied forces. Aurax prided themselves on discipline and technology. They were among the oldest spacefaring species in the Alliance, well known for their medical breakthroughs. "Dr. Cruz," Idrix said by way of greeting, "there is a problem in Ward 7. Several returning scouts have come back with respiratory ailments, possibly after inhaling the new variant of Moraine's desert spores. They've been quarantined, but I fear the spores may be laced with Ravik toxins." Her stomach tightened. "I'll head there right away. Have they been administered the Aurax inhalants yet?" "Of course. I've instructed the medics to apply the standard protocols, but I'd like you to evaluate them before we send them further up the chain." His tone suggested he was simply being thorough, but Eliana could read the tension in the set of his jaw. If the standard inhalant therapy failed, it would be yet another sign that the Rabik toxins were outpacing the Alliance's ability to counter them. She offered a quick nod, then headed inside the metal-walled corridor. Temperatures plummeted once she stepped through the airlock that separated the planet's punishing environment from the outpost's oxygen-regulated interior. The design was minimal: bare metal floors, overhead pipes rattling with life support fluids, and fluorescent lights that tinted every face a sickly white. She made her way toward Ward 7, passing crates of equipment labeled in multiple alien scripts. Their message was the same: medical supplies, property of the Allied forces. When she entered Ward 7, half a dozen cots lined the walls. 3 scouts lay sprawled on them, chests rising and falling in labored motions, eyes glazed with fever. A nurse, thin-limbed, with skin a pale lavender shade that marked her as a Marathi, guided Eliana toward the nearest patient. "This one arrived about an hour ago," the nurse said. "He collapsed at the entrance. We started the standard Aurax inhalant, but it's not helping." Eliana stepped close. The soldier, a Terran named Weiss, looked to be in his mid-30s. His body was drenched with sweat, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. The corners of his lips had a faint discoloration, bluish-purple. While she examined his vitals, a harsh cough rattled his frame. She took out a handheld scanner. "Pulse is spiking, blood oxygen levels are dangerously low. Any sign of internal bleeding?" "Not yet," the nurse said. But the new variant of Ravec toxins can cause hemorrhaging if it escalates. Eliana had studied the basics of Orax inhalants. They typically worked by suppressing an alien pathogen's ability to replicate inside respiratory tissues, but something about these spores seemed resistant. Set up a blood panel, full microtoxin screen, and get me antibiotic coverage for Earth-based flora as well. We can't rule anything out. You think a primitive antibiotic might help? The nurse's brow furrowed. Even though these toxins are advanced? We can't assume. Sometimes broad-spectrum coverage helps reduce secondary infections, even if it doesn't counter the main toxin directly. Eliana tried not to sound defensive, but she was aware that many aliens scoffed at Earth's so-called archaic medicine. Once the nurse moved to comply, Eliana turned to the next cot. The occupant was a scout from a reptilian species known as the Jara. He had thick scales across his chest, and fluid seeped from the corners of his wide-set eyes. The Orax inhalant lay discarded on the stand nearby. He'd apparently tried it but refused further doses. While Eliana bent to examine him, the Jar soldier hissed, "Burns my throat. No good." His voice was halting, the common tongue shaped awkwardly by his reptilian mouth. "Poison doesn't stop. Feels worse." She suppressed a surge of frustration. "I understand. Let me see if we can adjust the dosage, or try a mild analgesic to reduce the irritation." She lifted her scanner, noticing that the membrane behind his scales looked inflamed. If the inhalant was causing an allergic reaction, continuing would be counterproductive. But if he didn't receive some form of protective measure, the toxins could rampage through his respiratory tract. "We'll find another way," she murmured. "Just hang in there." He gave a shallow nod. A sudden commotion at the entrance made her turn. Kelsa, a Velen technician she knew, rushed inside. Velen were tall, lanky beings with elongated limbs and deep-set eyes. Kelsa's eyes were bright with alarm, her voice breathy. "Dr. Cruz, I think you should see this. Some of the scouts we just decontaminated are showing signs of a new kind of infection." Eliana pressed her lips into a grim line. "Lead the way." They hurried past a series of corridors until they reached the decontamination bay. The facility was a sealed environment with partitions for showers, scanning booths, and disposal units for contaminated gear. There, 2 more scouts lay on portable gurneys, each of them trembling and moaning in pain. The overhead lights flickered, as if uncertain whether to reveal or conceal the severity of the situation. Kelsa guided Eliana closer to the first scout, a wiry Orax soldier with a pale silver crest. He was among a group that ventured into the southern canyons. They reported encountering Ravec patrols. Within minutes of returning here, he started convulsing. Eliana lifted the scanner to the soldier's chest. His heartbeat thudded at a frantic pace. She checked the readouts and her stomach lurched. "This isn't just a spore inhalation," she said softly. "His cells are showing signs of a new biochemical agent. It's not purely a local toxin. It seems to be attacking his nervous system." She wanted to summon Commander Idrix for an emergency consultation, but she knew precisely what he would recommend: intensify Orax antitoxin therapy or request an urgent supply drop from the Orax homeland. That might take days. If the Ravec had refined a new agent, every hour counted. The longer they waited for official solutions, the more her patients would slip away. Behind them, a nurse arrived with the scout's chart. "Dr. Cruz, the standard panel indicates severe hemolysis. The red blood cells are bursting. We've never seen this before." Eliana kept her composure. "Get me a sample. I want a direct look." She found an abandoned table in the corner of the bay, grabbed a portable microscope, and began her analysis. The swirling patterns of cell destruction nearly made her gasp. The toxin seemed to latch onto specific proteins, a mechanism she'd never encountered outside theoretical textbooks. Yet the more she watched, the more a memory tugged at the back of her mind. An Earth-based parasite from her early training had shown a similarly aggressive pattern, except humans, with early antibiotic support and rest, often survived that parasite through rapid immunological adaptation. Earth's microbes, though less advanced than off-world pathogens, had forced humanity to evolve robust, surprisingly flexible immune responses. As she busied herself, Commander Idrix arrived, his boots clattering on the metal grate. Behind him trailed a security detail. "Dr. Cruz, I've been informed we have a growing crisis." His gaze landed on the convulsing Orax scout. "I see you've discovered a new facet of the Ravix arsenal." Eliana turned to face him. "Yes, Commander. We have at least 4 soldiers displaying a unique pattern of hemolysis. The standard Orax medications aren't working. We need to consider alternative measures." Idrix's brow ridges lifted. "We must keep using the inhalant therapy to limit the spread. I've already contacted the nearest Orax fleet for advanced supplies, which could take days to arrive," she said quietly. "I'm worried these soldiers won't make it that long." He crossed his arms. "We do not have unlimited resources here, and I cannot sanction unverified methods. The Orax approach is the single most advanced known to the Alliance. If it fails, there is little else we can do." She bristled at the tone in his voice, the implied futility. "Commander, I've seen partial parallels in Earth-based infections. Our immune systems can develop new antibodies faster than some species if given a chance. We might buy time by supporting these patients with broad-spectrum antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, and supportive treatments that let their own bodies fight the toxin. Humans have survived diseases we never had cures for, purely through immune adaptation." His features turned stony. Typical Terran optimism. "Our knowledge surpasses those medieval remedies your people once used. The data on human resilience is inconclusive." She clenched her fists. "With respect, sir, I'd like to try. I won't use up your precious Orax supplies. Just let me administer simple supportive care and monitor for an immune response. If the soldiers are doomed anyway, we have nothing to lose." Idrix hesitated. She could see the calculations playing out behind his amber eyes. He was deeply loyal to the Orax medical doctrine, certain of its superiority, yet some pragmatic side of him must have realized that all standard measures were failing. After a moment, he offered a curt nod. "Very well, but keep your experiments contained. I don't want them interfering with the real work." Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched out. The tension in the air lingered even after he was gone. Eliana let out a slow breath. "I'll do my best," she muttered, heading for the supply closet where they kept the basic Earth pharmaceuticals. Kelsa followed close behind, her tall figure looming over the storage crates, ready to assist. "Are you sure this is the right approach?" Kelsa asked, her voice hushed. "Commander Idrix can be inflexible." "We have to try," Eliana said. "I'm not discarding Orax medicine. I'm just applying what I know from Earth's playbook. If the Rabic have found a way around Orax methods, maybe they're gambling that we've neglected older or simpler approaches." By the time they returned to the patients, the condition of the convulsing Orax soldier had worsened. Eliana wasted no time, instructing a nurse to start an IV of broad-spectrum antibiotics plus intravenous fluids. She double-checked the dosage. After all, this was an Orax physiology, not human, so she had to carefully calculate the relative body mass and metabolic differences. She also added an immune booster commonly used for Terrans. Uncertain how an Orax body might handle it, with a careful breath she administered the first dose. Hours passed in a blur of lab tests, vital sign checks, and frantic calculations. Scouts in adjacent wards arrived with variations of the same symptoms. No single remedy seemed to halt the progression of the Ravec toxin. Soldiers from half a dozen species grew pale and delirious. At mealtime, Eliana barely had time for a protein bar, which she chewed mechanically while scanning patient charts on her handheld device. Mid-afternoon, Kelsa hurried to Eliana's side. "We got partial lab results. One of the Terran soldiers in Ward 9, has started producing unusual antibodies. The readout is unlike anything I've seen in the Orax database." That news cut through Eliana's fatigue. She set down the chart she was studying and rushed toward Ward 9. She remembered Weiss, the first one she'd assessed that morning. If his immune system truly was generating new antibodies, she needed to see it. Ward 9 was quieter than the others, overshadowed by the drone of equipment. Weiss lay on his cot, an oxygen mask strapped to his face. He was pale and soaked in sweat, but he was conscious. His eyes followed her movements as she approached. Cruz, he croaked, his voice muffled by the mask. Feels like my blood's on fire. She gently touched his arm. I'm sorry you're in pain, but the test results show something promising. Your body is making new antibodies that might fight this toxin. His eyelids fluttered. You sure about that? She gave a reassuring nod, though inside she was as unsure as he was. I'd like to draw a few more samples to confirm. You're already on supportive therapy, so let's see if we can help your system do the rest. He nodded weakly, too exhausted for questions. With Kelsa's help, Eliana withdrew a sample of his blood and studied it under a portable analyzer. There it was, a faint but distinct reading of newly synthesized immunoglobulins. Eliana stared at the data, her heart pounding. If Weiss's immune system had begun to decode the Ravec toxin, perhaps they could harness that immunity to develop something akin to a serum, a novel approach, definitely outside the standard ORAX procedures. She looked up at Kelsa. We need to see if these immunoglobulins can be replicated or adapted to help others, but it's too soon to be sure. Kelsa tilted her head, her large, dark eyes reflecting the glow of the analyzer. Do you have enough equipment for that kind of procedure? This is a forward outpost, not a state-of-the-art lab. We have some basic biotech modules. It'll be messy, improvised. But if we can refine these antibodies, maybe we can produce a short-term injection for the other infected soldiers. The question is whether Commander Idrix will let us, Kelsa grimaced. He'd probably confiscate your equipment if he thinks you're meddling with untested methods. But perhaps you can work under the radar. A hum of alarm signals rang from deeper in the facility, and an announcement echoed over the intercom. Medical staff, prepare for incoming casualties. Ravec forces spotted near the southwestern ridge. Possible gas exposure. Eliana exhaled shakily. Under the radar might be our only option. The next several hours were a frantic rush. More soldiers poured in, many coughing blood or suffering convulsions as the toxin ravaged their systems. Commander Idrix ordered a mass administration of enhanced ORAX antitoxins, but the results remained inconclusive. Eliana complied with the order in a limited capacity, balancing the ORAX approach with supportive measures. She also discreetly collected blood samples from the newly arrived human soldiers. Some showed early signs of generating the same novel antibodies that Weiss had, though at varied levels. The outpost's tension was palpable. Shouted orders echoed through corridors. A sense of desperation lingered in the stale, recycled air. Even the overhead lights seemed to flicker more often, as though the building itself was anxious. In a cramped back room that once served as a storage closet, Eliana set up a makeshift lab. Kelsa had helped her smuggle in a small centrifuge, a batch of reagents, and a trans-species blood compatibility kit. Together they examined how the new antibodies from Weiss's blood interacted with samples from Orax, Jara, Velen, and various other species. The process was slow and often inconclusive. Some samples clotted. Others showed signs of partial neutralization of the toxin. It was a patchwork process, a dance of trial and error. At one point, a swirl of red liquid in the analyzer sparked a glimmer of hope. Kelsa typed rapidly on a control pad, scanning the digital readout. These readings suggest the antibodies from Weiss can latch onto a key protein in the Ravec toxin. Eliana leaned over her shoulder. Then, theoretically, they could inhibit the toxin. But will it work in a living body that isn't human? Kelsa's elongated fingers drummed against the console. We can attempt a test on a volunteer with no other options. They exchanged grim looks. Finding a volunteer meant revealing this unapproved experiment, yet the alternative was standing by while patients died. Eliana steeled herself. Let's see if any Orax soldier is too far gone for standard treatment. That might be the one scenario where Idrix would allow it. Before she could even finish her plan, a priority call sounded through the station's comm line. Dr. Cruz, please report to Ward 2 immediately. She felt her heart jolt. Ward 2 housed the Orax scout who had first shown severe hemolysis. She and Kelsa raced there. Commander Yidrix was already in the ward, standing over the scout's trembling form. Medical equipment beeped frantically, and the soldier's skin had taken on an ashen tint that made him look more like a statue than a living being. Eliana forced her way through the small crowd of medics to read the monitor. "He's crashing," one of the Orax medics said. "We tried all advanced therapies, but his RBC count continues to drop, and we can't stabilize him." Eliana felt Yidrix's glare without turning to meet it. She addressed the medic. "If we have no other recourse, let me try a small transfusion from a human donor. We have reason to believe it might carry neutralizing antibodies." "That's insane," someone muttered in the crowd, but nobody offered a viable alternative. Yidrix's voice came low and controlled, laced with tension. "You want to put Terran blood into an Orax body? You have no idea how catastrophic the immunological response could be." She pressed her lips together. "Commander, he's dying. Any catastrophic response wouldn't be worse than what's happening now. Let me attempt a controlled transfusion, a small volume, to see if it stabilizes him." She swallowed. "I can use a cross-species infusion technique. We have protocols for it, even if it's rarely done." Silence hung for a moment. The patient shuddered, eyes rolling back. At last Commander Yidrix nodded. "Do it. And if he dies, you will answer for this." She wasted no time. Within minutes, she had arranged for half a pint of blood from the Terran soldier Weiss, who was too weak to protest but gave a faint nod of consent. Using a specialized filter to remove certain human antigens, Eliana prepared the infusion and administered it via a slow drip. The entire ward seemed to hold its breath. At first, the Orax scout's vitals continued to plummet. Eliana felt a cold sweat trickle down her back. Then, after several agonizing minutes, his oxygen saturation steadied. The beep of the heart monitor found a slightly more regular rhythm. His convulsions eased, replaced by stillness, which could be ominous or could be relief. She tentatively checked his pulse, hoping for a sign of stabilization. Commander Yidrix hovered near the edge of the cot. "Well," he demanded. "It's too soon to be certain," Eliana whispered. But so far, no sign of immediate rejection. For over an hour, the medical team monitored the scout's readings. The steady beep of the monitors felt like a lifeline. Inch by inch, the patient's red blood cell count climbed. His breathing eased. It wasn't a miraculous recovery, but it was enough to bring a hush of awe to the ward. Commander Yidrix stared at the screen, his arms crossed. "I don't understand why this worked when Orax therapies did not." Maybe the Ravik designed a toxin specifically to bypass your advanced treatments. "They might have overlooked simpler biological solutions," Eliana said softly. "And Earth's immune systems can be surprisingly adaptive. Humans have survived plagues, viruses, bacteria that historically wiped out entire populations of other species on contact. We had to develop robust defenses." The commander's jaw tightened, but he offered no immediate rebuttal. News traveled quickly through the outpost. A few hours later, a Jara soldier, also on the brink of death, received a similar infusion derived from Weiss's altered blood. She rallied enough to speak coherent sentences within the day. Though not every case was an unqualified success, the potential was undeniable. The question now was how to replicate the beneficial component, some type of newly formed antibody, on a larger scale without draining Weiss of blood. Commander Yidrix announced a plan. A specialized Orax medical shuttle would arrive in 2 days with reinforcements. Until then, they were on their own. He reluctantly granted Eliana and Kelsa a portion of the outpost's meager laboratory resources to attempt a crash program of synthesizing a so-called Terran antitoxin serum. Eliana spent day and night in that makeshift lab, turning the storage area into a hub of scientific desperation. Kelsa ran the machines. Various nurses from different species volunteered for sample collection. The flickering overhead lights and the clang of life support pumps became a constant backdrop to the frantic conversation of how to produce enough serum. Meanwhile, the Ravik attacks continued. They launched small-scale raids to test the outpost's defenses. The desert howled with chemical-laden storms. More casualties poured in, including a prominent Orax officer, Major Rin. She had commanded a squad that tried to ambush the Ravik but ended up exposed to the toxin-laced winds. By the time Major Rin was brought in, her condition was so grave that it was questionable whether even Terran-infused serum could help. Eliana tried anyway, hooking the Major up to an IV that included a refined fraction of Weiss's antibodies. No immediate improvement surfaced, forcing Eliana to watch in helpless frustration as the Major's vitals plummeted. By dawn, Major Rin's breathing had all but stopped. With shaking hands, Eliana prepared an advanced life support measure. They used a combination of mechanical ventilation and additional microdoses of the serum. Just when it seemed hopeless, the Major's heart rate returned to a stable rhythm. Her eyes flickered open, though she was too weak to speak. The entire medical team erupted into hushed cheers. Commander Edrix stood beside the cot, a haunted look in his eyes. "You saved her life," he told Eliana, though it sounded more like a grudging acknowledgement. "It appears your method has merit." "It's not just my method," she said. "It's the innate resilience of human physiology. The solutions we used are simple, almost archaic by your standards." He lowered his gaze. "I was mistaken to dismiss your approach." Yet the humility in his voice carried an undertone of something else. Perhaps shame or confusion that all his advanced protocols had failed. They had little time to celebrate. The next day the outpost shook under a barrage of Ravik artillery. Sirens blared and half the staff scrambled to defensive positions. Chemical alarms sounded, indicating that waves of toxic gas had penetrated the outer corridor. Eliana barricaded herself in the lab with Kelsa and 2 terrified nurses. Over the comm, Commander Idrix ordered an evacuation drill, but the labyrinth of hallways leading to the landing pads was compromised by pockets of lethal gas. As bombs thundered overhead, Dr. Cruz kept working. She and Kelsa sealed the lab doors, turned on backup oxygen scrubbers, and continued refining the serum. Dozens of wounded were brought in with advanced nerve damage, their limbs twitching uncontrollably, their eyes glassy with shock. She pushed her fatigue aside. If their efforts failed, the entire outpost would succumb. Weiss himself was still in the infirmary, recovering. He'd become a reluctant hero, the so-called walking antibody factory. One moment he was stable, the next moment his fever spiked. Eliana paid him frequent visits, adjusting his fluids and ensuring his body wasn't overexploited for serum production. She felt torn, using him as a living resource while also wanting to protect him as a patient. She tried to reassure him every time she drew more blood. He always said yes, determined to save as many people as possible, but the cost weighed on her conscience. After an entire sleepless night, they finally produced a small batch of a purified antibody serum. Kelsa tested it on samples from multiple species. The results were uneven, but at least half showed moderate to strong neutralization of the toxin. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it could be enough to buy time for the body to heal itself. If an infected soldier got the serum early, the chances of survival improved drastically. Commander Yidrix authorized immediate use, bypassing standard protocols in the face of the crisis. Dr. Cruz and her team administered the serum to the worst cases first. The shift from unstoppable meltdown to slow, tentative recovery felt like a dream. The monitors, once shrill with alarm, turned calmer. Whispers of relief spread among the staff. In the late afternoon, the Ravik artillery assault subsided. Word arrived that an Allied reinforcement fleet had engaged Ravik forces in orbit. The outpost was still at risk, but for the moment the siege eased. Kelsa joined Eliana for a short break in a side corridor where they sat on the floor, backs against the cold metal wall, exhaustion soaking every fiber of their body. Kelsa's voice was soft. "You think we might actually get out of this?" Eliana managed a wry smile. "If the Orax reinforcements arrive as planned, we stand a decent chance. And now that we have a workable serum, fewer people should die. But the Ravik won't stop. They'll keep adapting. Eventually they'll craft another toxin that bypasses this one, or they'll saturate the entire planet with gas." "We'll adapt too," Eliana said. "That's been humanity's story for millennia." We're not the biggest or the strongest, but we adapt, and we'll share that strength with the rest of the Alliance. Maybe the Ravik can't keep up with every twist of evolution across so many species. Kelsa studied her with those dark, reflective eyes. You've changed how I see Terrans. I always assumed your people needed advanced pharmaceuticals for every off-world disease. Now I realize how much your bodies can handle on their own. It's not always pretty, Eliana said. Humanity lost millions of lives to plagues in our history. That's part of why our immune systems are so versatile. We were shaped by constant struggle. Commander Idrix appeared at the corridor's junction, looking more haggard than Eliana had ever seen him. Dust and a faint chemical residue clung to the edges of his uniform. He motioned for them to stand. I just received an update. The Orax medical shuttle is 2 hours away. We'll have a brief window to get our patients and staff out before the Ravik regroup. But some of the outer wards have collapsed, and the path to the landing pad is blocked in multiple areas. We may need to move everyone through the sub-level tunnels. Eliana rubbed her eyes, forcing herself to focus. Then let's do it. I can have the medical teams load the critically ill onto portable stretchers. The serum supply is still limited, so we have to move them carefully. Idrix nodded, then paused. A look of unease played across his features. I also received an alarming piece of intelligence. The Ravik might have a deeper infiltration plan. We suspect there could be saboteurs already inside the outpost. He took a measured breath. We can't remain here. We must evacuate. I'll rally the security detail. Within the hour, the exodus began. Nurses, doctors, and able-bodied soldiers guided the wounded into lower tunnels originally used for storage. The sublevels were cramped, poorly lit, and often partially flooded by condensation that dripped from corroded pipes. Everyone moved as quickly as possible, mindful that a single sabotage attempt could trap them all underground. Eliana oversaw the stretcher-bearing Weiss, who was pale and trembling with fever. Another soldier toted the serum canisters, only a few liters worth. Every step felt precarious, the murky gloom pressing in from all sides. Occasionally, they heard distant explosions reverberate through the stone, reminding them that the Ravik wanted them destroyed. When the path forked, Commander Idrix led them left, explaining it was a route that ascended more gradually to the surface near the landing pads. They advanced in tense silence, flashlights glinting on the wet walls. Suddenly, gunfire echoed behind them. Shouts and screams followed. A sabotage cell had ambushed part of the group. Idrix cursed under his breath, ordering the healthy soldiers to form a defensive line. Eliana ducked behind a pile of crates, shielding the stretcher that carried Weiss. She clutched the small kit bag that contained extra syringes of serum. In the flickering flashlight beams, she glimpsed uniformed shapes exchanging fire. Metallic clinks and the hiss of some chemical discharge filled the cramped space with acrid smoke. She pressed a hand to Weiss's forehead, feeling the burn of his fever. She worried that if the sabotage cell reached them, they'd lose every chance to save the lives depending on the serum. Minutes stretched out like hours. Then the scuffle died down, and Idrix returned, face grim but uninjured. He signaled for them to press on. Some had fallen in the ambush, but the main group still had to reach the surface. When they arrived at a wide subterranean chamber, the corridor beyond it had collapsed. Stones and twisted metal blocked the path. "We're stuck," a soldier groaned. "We'll never clear this in time." Kelsa hurried over to the debris, rummaging in her utility belt. "I have a microblaster that might cut through the smaller chunks, but the largest boulders may be too heavy." Commander Idrix ground his teeth. "We have to try. The Orax shuttle lands soon. This is our only route." While the soldiers attempted to clear the corridor, Eliana slipped aside to recheck the vital signs of the patients on stretchers. One of them, a Jara scout, had turned dangerously cyanotic. She had no choice but to give him a direct injection of the serum. Her hands shook from exhaustion, but she steadied enough to administer the dose. The reaction was immediate. He gasped, the color returning to his face in subtle increments. "Thank you," he rasped. Eliana offered a small smile, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. "Hang in there." Behind her, a cheer went up. Kelsa and the soldiers had managed to blast a narrow crawl space through the rubble. It wasn't tall enough to walk upright, but they could at least pass through single file. Carefully, they maneuvered the stretchers in, and inch by inch the group pulled themselves out of the blockage. On the other side, they emerged into a half-collapsed service corridor that sloped upward. At the far end, rays of dusty light indicated a breach to the surface. Commander Yidrix directed them that way. Eventually, they stepped into the open air, into a bleak morning sky streaked with swirling red dust. The landing pads lay 200 meters ahead, battered by the previous day's bombardment but still intact. The silhouettes of 2 Orax shuttles were visible, engines idling. One shuttle had begun loading survivors, the severely injured first, along with civilians or non-combatants. Eliana and Kelsa led the medical group onto the second shuttle, ensuring that patients on stretchers were spaced to accommodate intravenous lines and monitoring equipment. She oversaw Weiss's transfer personally, heart pounding with relief that he was still alive. Before the loading ramp closed, Eliana saw Commander Idrix silhouetted against the burning horizon. He was directing the last pockets of security forces to board. A wave of Ravik artillery boomed in the distance, sending up plumes of dust. The shuttle pilot shouted that they had to lift off or they'd be shot down. At last, Idrix boarded, glancing at Eliana with an expression that mixed relief and regret. "We're out of time." The shuttle doors sealed. Engines roared, lifting them from Moraine's battered surface. Through a viewing window, Eliana watched the desert recede. The swirl of crimson sands and battered outpost structures shrank away. She let out a trembling exhale, every muscle in her body aching from stress and overuse. Inside the shuttle's cargo bay, rows of stretchers and seats bristled with wounded. Droning thrusters drowned out quiet moans and hushed conversation. Eliana moved from one patient to another, adjusting IV drips, checking pulses. A few Orax medics assisted, looking to her now with a degree of respect she hadn't sensed before. They were halfway into the upper atmosphere when Kelsa approached, placing a hand lightly on Eliana's shoulder. "Look at Weiss," Kelsa murmured. He was resting more comfortably, half sitting up on his stretcher, no longer trembling. Though obviously weak, he managed a faint grin. "Hey, Doc," he said in a raspy voice. "We made it." She knelt beside him. "We did. But you're not off the hook. We're going to a proper facility now, and they'll want to study your blood." He coughed a low laugh. "Who knew that slogging through Earth's diseases would ever pay off, huh? Maybe all that time people on Earth spent fighting viruses and bacteria was the best training we could have asked for," she said quietly. A few Orax medics were listening. One of them ventured, "Dr. Cruz, do you believe that Terran immune systems might become the basis for new lines of defense against Ravik weapons?" She rubbed the back of her neck. "Possibly. We'll have to do more research. It might not be just humans. Other species could incorporate the same or similar immunological breakthroughs, maybe blending it with Orax biotech in the future." Commander Idrix stepped over to them, the hum of the shuttle's engine vibrating through the floor. He inhaled sharply before speaking. "We owe you and Weiss a debt. I regret having dismissed Terran methods." She recognized how difficult those words were for him. "Thank you, Commander. But this was a team effort, and it doesn't end here. There will be more toxins, more battles. Now at least we have a foothold." He gave a curt nod. "We do. Once we're in a secure orbit, we'll transfer to the capital ship for better medical care. The entire Alliance must be briefed on these findings." Weiss closed his eyes, relief washing across his features. For a long moment, Eliana simply knelt there, letting the swirl of conflicting emotions subside. She recalled how the galaxy had labeled humans technologically behind, physically unimpressive, in need of paternalistic guardianship. Yet under the strain of the Ravik's cutting-edge biochemical war, it was human adaptability that had provided a lifeline. The Orax medicine was advanced, but the Ravik had designed their weapons to slip around advanced therapies. They had not accounted for the dogged evolution of a species that had for centuries battled nature's brutal tests with little more than primitive cures and raw determination. As the shuttle broke through Moraine's exosphere, a swirl of stars became visible in the viewport. The battered planet below shrank, revealing a wide horizon of space. Beyond, Eliana could make out faint flashes of distant weapons fire, the ongoing clash between the Allied fleet and Revek's ships. Yet in this cramped cargo bay, a sense of possibility took root. If humans could share their immune secrets, perhaps the entire alliance would have a stronger shield against the horrors of biochemical warfare. Later, when the shuttle docked with the Orax capital ship, medical droids and staff rushed aboard to stabilize the most critical cases. Eliana gave them a brief rundown of the Terran-based serum they'd developed. She steeled herself, expecting skeptical stares and condescending remarks. Instead, the Orax doctors listened intently, no trace of mockery in their eyes. She realized the war had changed everything. The old assumptions were crumbling, just like the outpost on Moraine. Necessity was forging new alliances, new ideas. She glimpsed a future in which Terran immune systems would become the bedrock of a universal approach to Ravik toxins, a synergy of advanced alien technology and Earth's ancient, rugged biology. Weiss was carefully lifted onto a specialized hover gurney. Eliana walked beside him as they guided it down a pristine corridor to a large medical suite. Everything here was sleek, with automated arms extending from the ceiling, scanning vitals at a glance, mixing compounds in seconds. She felt a twinge of culture shock, recalling how only days ago she'd been messing around with a battered microscope in a cramped storage closet. This was the pinnacle of Orax medical engineering, a place humans would ordinarily be in awe of. She gave instructions to the Orax staff about the transfusion and the partial cross-species compatibility. One of the senior Orax doctors, a tall figure with luminescent patches on his cheeks, studied her notes. "We'll replicate the procedure for the new arrivals. Should we also attempt to refine the serum further?" "Yes," Eliana said, trying to quell her excitement. "We discovered that Terran immune response can produce these specialized antibodies within about 12 to 24 hours of exposure. If we can isolate them quickly and replicate them, we'll have a fairly broad defense." The Orax doctor typed rapidly on a console. "Perhaps we can incorporate these proteins into our next line of inhalant therapy. We've been struggling to keep up with Ravik's mutations, but now a combined approach might stand a chance." Commander Yidrix watched the exchange, arms behind his back. His expression remained subdued, but his gaze no longer dismissed Earth's potential. "Dr. Cruz, I'll see to it that you receive the resources you need. The entire Alliance Medical Board should be briefed. There's a chance we can turn the tide if we act fast." She nodded, hardly believing the shift in his attitude. "We can start by stabilizing everyone who's still suffering from the toxins. Then maybe we can refine the serum for prophylactic use, if the Ravik deploy another wave." Weiss managed a weak grin from his gurney. "I just hope I won't be the only blood donor. I'm running on fumes over here, Doc." Eliana patted his shoulder. "I'll make sure you're not stuck with that job forever." A silent moment passed as they all stood in that immaculate corridor. The walls hummed with the faint power of advanced technology. Outside the viewport, glimpses of the ongoing space battle flashed like distant lightning. But inside this medical suite, the flicker of hope was stronger than the darkness of war. Eliana felt tears prick at her eyes. She turned away before letting them fall, occupying herself with the medical equipment. They had lost many back on Moraine, and the fight was far from over. Yet for the first time she sensed a genuine spark of unity among the Orax staff, among Kelsa, among the battered survivors who had placed their faith in a young human doctor's belief that sometimes simpler solutions worked best. In the days that followed, the Orax capital ship cruised away from Moraine's orbit, reorganizing its forces to join the Allied fleet. The labs buzzed with activity as Eliana worked with Orax specialists to refine the Terran antibody serum. Commander Idrix arranged for official transmissions that carried the data to other Allied worlds, urging them to incorporate these revelations into their own defensive strategies. A handful of severely injured troops faced uncertain outcomes, but the majority who received the serum experienced a surprising resilience. An unspoken camaraderie grew between Eliana and Idrix, even if it was not exactly friendship. He began asking her direct questions about human medical history, about how Earth had once survived waves of pandemics. She learned that the Orax had a cultural reverence for advanced solutions, seeing simpler methods as archaic and therefore useless. Never had it occurred to them that what they called primitive might be the very resilience that confounded the rest. She, in turn, acknowledged that the Orax had sophisticated technology Earth could only dream of. Together, perhaps they could combine the best of both worlds. Kelsa continued to assist, becoming Eliana's closest collaborator and confidant. The Velen technician's quick mind and calm demeanor stabilized the often chaotic process of bridging Terran and Orax science. Late at night, they would swap stories about their respective homeworlds. Kelsa's star-shaped pupils would widen in fascination when Eliana described how humans had discovered penicillin by accident, or how countless diseases had nearly wiped out entire nations before Earth's medical community caught up. Kelsa would share how the Velen overcame a planetary epidemic by forging alliances with another species that lived underground, trading gene therapy secrets. Each culture had found survival in improbable ways, and that synergy gave them hope that the alliance could endure the Ravik's worst. The quiet beep alerted Eliana that the final test batch of Terran Orax inhalants was complete. She and Kelsa studied the results. The data showed improved neutralization rates against multiple strains of the Ravik toxin. Not a silver bullet, but at least a partial shield. Enough, perhaps, to keep more soldiers alive, while the Alliance gathered force for a counterstrike. Exhausted, Eliana sank into a chair. She thought of Weiss, still bedridden but stable, of the many soldiers from Moraine's outpost who had lived thanks to a cross-species infusion no one had dared attempt before. Above all, she thought of Earth, the humble birth world the galaxy often regarded with half pity, half amusement. The Ravik had not counted on the stubborn intricacies of Terran immune responses. Commander Idrix stood at the doorway, observing them. "The fleet has begun to push the Ravik back from the southwestern quadrant," he said. "It seems your work is already making a difference. Reports from other outposts indicate the new serum has been distributed. Casualty rates are down." Eliana swallowed. "I'm glad, but we can't get complacent. The Ravik will adapt." He stepped closer. "So must we, Doctor. And if there's one thing humans have proven, it's that adaptation is sometimes more powerful than raw technology." She allowed herself the tiniest smile. "Yes, Commander, that's exactly it." He offered a hand. She rose, feeling a sense of solidarity. They had both risked their reputations, she by defying protocols, he by finally endorsing an unorthodox method. But the stakes were bigger than any single ego. The corridor outside was quieter now, the ship stable in its new orbit. This was not the end of the war, but the beginning of a new chapter in interstellar cooperation. In a chamber off the lab, Weiss dozed peacefully, an IV in his arm replenishing his strength. Several other survivors rested on cots, wearing the looks of people who had faced death and emerged hopeful. The hiss of the life support systems was a gentle lullaby in a place that, days ago, had been a cacophony of tragedy. Eliana moved among them, checking pulses, adjusting pillows, answering the occasional question in multiple alien tongues. Some of the patients gave weak but genuine smiles of gratitude. One Orax soldier gripped her hand and nodded solemnly, a gesture of deep respect among that species. She ended her rounds at the viewport, gazing into the infinite sprawl of stars. Even here, far from Earth, she felt a quiet pride in her heritage. Humanity's long history of battling unseen enemies, viruses, bacteria, parasites, had taught them resilience in ways that perhaps no amount of advanced engineering could replicate. By combining that tenacity with the Orax capacity for rapid technological innovation, they might forge a better defense for all species in the Alliance. She allowed herself a moment of reflection, recalling the battered outpost on Moraine and the wounded who had looked to her for salvation. Despite all the heartbreak, the memory now glimmered with promise. A faint reflection caught her eye. She turned to see Commander Idrix approaching again, his posture more at ease. "We'll be leaving for the Alliance's Central Research Station soon," he said, voice gentler than she was used to. "Your presence will be required there to oversee further production of the new serum. The Council has questions, and you're the best one to explain the details." She nodded. "I'll go, of course. But I'd like to ensure the rest of my patients are stable first. I'll assign staff to assist." He paused. "I realize that adjusting to the ORAC stations might be uncomfortable. If you need anything—" "Thank you, Commander," she said, meaning it. A piece of tension in her chest melted away. He gave a brief, respectful bow, a gesture that from him carried monumental significance, and left her to her thoughts. She breathed in slowly, shoulders relaxing. She was no hero, just a physician who had recognized that sometimes the body can heal itself if given the proper support, but she could live with that role. She recalled the startled faces of those who had witnessed the Cross-Spexy's blood transfusion and the slow shift from disbelief to hope in the ward. Those moments reminded her why she'd become a doctor in the first place: to give living beings a fighting chance. Outside, the swirl of stars sparkled across an endless canvas. In that cosmic vastness, humanity might seem small and vulnerable. Yet the secret to survival had never been about being the biggest or the strongest. It was about adapting, learning, persevering. The war with the Ravik might rage on, but now the Alliance knew that the so-called fragile humans were capable of forging new paths. The advanced species who had once believed Earth needed their every medical crutch began to see that within human blood and history lay a power that not even the most cutting-edge weapons could easily outrun. Eliana Cruz stood in that silent corridor, letting her weary mind drift. Tomorrow they would reach the Central Research Station. Tomorrow she would testify before alien scientists and military strategists who had never imagined Terrans might hold a key to defeating the Ravek toxins. Tomorrow the healing would continue. For now she allowed herself a single profound thought. Earth was no mere backwater world. Its children carried the scars of 1,000 ancient battles against invisible foes, battles that had shaped their genetics and their will. And though the galaxy had advanced far beyond anything Earth once knew, they could still learn from the simplest truths. Sometimes resilience trumped sophistication. Sometimes forging a new serum demanded not the mightiest lab, but the quiet miracle of adaptation that lay beneath human skin. She closed her eyes, feeling the soft hum of life support, the distant vibrations of starship engines, and the subtle beating of her own heart. In that moment, she felt connected to every being who had fought for a chance to live, human or alien, soldier or civilian. And she knew with a calm certainty that the shared victory of survival would light the path through the darkest storms.